Hello everyone, and welcome back to BookWaves for the grand finale of our journey in Cranford. We now arrive at the conclusion of Elizabeth Gaskell's masterpiece. In our last episode, we left our dear Miss Matty facing ruin, supported only by the profound kindness of her friends. As we step into Chapter 15 and Chapter 16, her story, and the story of the entire town, reaches its heartwarming resolution. As Miss Matty bravely adapts to her new life with quiet dignity, a mysterious stranger arrives from a distant land. His appearance will solve a lifelong family mystery and bring a wave of unexpected happiness that no one, least of all Miss Matty, ever dared to dream of. How does a single return bring peace to an entire community? And what is the final, gentle lesson that Cranford has to teach us about love, loyalty, and a well-lived life? This is the conclusion we have all been waiting for. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from beginning to end. Please share your final thoughts on the novel in the comments below. Let us now discover how peace finally comes to Cranford. Chapter 15. Before I left Miss Matty at Cranford, everything had been comfortably arranged for her. Even Mrs. Jameson's approval of her selling tea had been gained. That oracle had taken a few days to consider whether by so doing Miss Matty would forfeit her right to the privileges of society in Cranford. I think she had some little idea of mortifying Lady Glenmire by the decision she gave at last. The decision was to this effect: that whereas a married woman takes her husband's rank by the strict laws of precedence, an unmarried woman retains the station her father occupied. So Cranford was allowed to visit Miss Matty, and whether allowed or not, the town certainly intended to visit Lady Glenmire. But we were met with surprise, and indeed dismay, when we learned that Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins were returning on the following Tuesday. Mrs. Hoggins, had she absolutely dropped her title? Had she, in a spirit of bravado, cut the aristocracy to become a Hoggins? She, who might have been called Lady Glenmire to her dying day. Mrs. Jameson was pleased. She said it only convinced her of what she had known from the first, that the woman she referred to as the creature had a low taste. But this so-called creature looked very happy on Sunday at church, nor did we see it necessary to keep our veils down on the side of our bonnets where Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins sat, as Mrs. Jameson did. She thereby missed all the smiling glory of his face, and all the becoming blushes of hers. I am not sure if Martha and Jem looked more radiant in the afternoon when they, too, made their first appearance. Mrs. Jameson soothed the turbulence of her soul by having the blinds of her windows drawn down as if for a funeral on the day when Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins received callers. It was with some difficulty that she was prevailed upon to continue the St. James's Chronicle, so indignant was she with its having inserted the announcement of the marriage. Miss Matty's sale went off famously. She retained the furniture of her sitting room and bedroom. She was to occupy the former until Martha could meet with a lodger who might wish to take it. Into this sitting room and bedroom she had to cram all sorts of things which, the auctioneer assured her, were bought in for her at the sale by an unknown friend. I always suspected Mrs. Fitzadam of this, but she must have had an accessory who knew what articles were particularly regarded by Miss Matty on account of their associations with her early days. The rest of the house looked rather bare, to be sure, all except one tiny bedroom. My father allowed me to purchase the furniture for that room for my occasional use in case of Miss Matty's illness. I had expended my own small store in buying all manner of comfits and lozenges in order to tempt the little people whom Miss Matty loved so much to come about her. We had tea in bright green canisters and comfits in tumblers. Miss Matty and I felt quite proud as we looked round us on the evening before the shop was to be opened. Martha had scoured the boarded floor to a white cleanness, and it was adorned with a brilliant piece of oilcloth. Customers were to stand on this before the table counter. The wholesome smell of plaster and whitewash pervaded the apartment. A very small sign indicating that Matilda Jenkins was licensed to sell tea was hidden under the lintel of the new door. 2 boxes of tea with cabalistic inscriptions all over them stood ready to disgorge their contents into the canisters. I ought to have mentioned before that Miss Matty had had some scruples of conscience at selling tea. This was because there was already Mr. Johnson in the town who included it among his numerous commodities. Before she could quite reconcile herself to the adoption of her new business, she had trotted down to his shop, unknown to me. She went to tell him of the project that was being entertained and to inquire if it was likely to injure his business. My father called this idea of hers great nonsense. He wondered aloud how tradespeople were to get on if there was to be a continual consulting of each other's interests, which would put a stop to all competition directly. And perhaps such a gesture would not have worked in Drumble, but in Cranford it answered very well. For not only did Mr. Johnson kindly put at rest all Miss Matty's scruples and her fear of injuring his business, but I have reason to know he repeatedly sent customers to her. He would tell them that the teas he kept were of a common kind, but that Miss Jenkins had all the choice sorts. And expensive tea is a very favorite luxury with people who are well-to-do, like prosperous tradespeople and rich farmers' wives. They tend to turn up their noses at the Kongu and souchong prevalent at many tables of gentility, and will have nothing else than gunpowder and pekoe for themselves. But to return to Miss Matty, it was really very pleasant to see how her unselfishness and simple sense of justice called out the same good qualities in others. She never seemed to think anyone would impose upon her, because she herself would be so grieved to do it to them. I have heard her put a stop to the fervent declarations of the man who brought her coals by quietly stating that she was sure he would be sorry to bring her the wrong weight. And if the coals were short measure that time, I do not believe they ever were again. People would have felt as much ashamed of presuming on her good faith as they would have done on that of a child. But my father often says that such simplicity might be very well in Cranford, but would never do in the world. And I fancy the world must be very bad, for with all my father's suspicion of everyone with whom he has dealings, and in spite of all his many precautions, he lost upwards of £1,000 by roguery only last year. I just stayed long enough to establish Miss Matty in her new mode of life and to pack up the library which the rector had purchased. He had written a very kind letter to Miss Matty. In it, he expressed how glad he would be to take a library so well selected, as he knew the late Mr. Jenkins must have been at any valuation put upon them. And when she agreed to this, with a touch of sorrowful gladness that the books would go back to the rectory and be arranged on the accustomed walls once more, he sent word that he feared he had not room for them all. He asked if perhaps Miss Matty would kindly allow him to leave some volumes on her shelves. But Miss Matty replied that she had her Bible and a copy of Johnson's dictionary, and was afraid she would not have much time for reading. Still, I retained a few books out of consideration for the rector's kindness. The money which the rector had paid, and that produced by the sale, was partly expended in the stock of tea. Part of it was invested against a rainy day, that is, for old age or illness. It was but a small sum, it is true, and it occasioned a few evasions of truth and white lies. I think all of these are very wrong indeed in theory, and I would rather not put them in practice. We did this because we knew Miss Matty would be perplexed as to her duty if she were aware of any little reserve fund being made for her while the debts of the bank remained unpaid. Moreover, she had never been told of the way in which her friends were contributing to pay the rent. I should have liked to tell her this, but the mystery of the affair gave a piquancy to their deed of kindness which the ladies were unwilling to give up. At first, Martha had to shirk many a perplexed question as to her ways and means of living in such a house. But by and by, Miss Matty's prudent uneasiness sank down into acquiescence with the existing arrangement. I left Miss Matty with a good heart. Her sales of tea during the first 2 days had surpassed my most sanguine expectations. The whole country round seemed to be all out of tea at once. The only alteration I could have desired in Miss Matty's way of doing business was that she should not have so plaintively entreated some of her customers not to buy green tea. She was always running it down as a slow poison, sure to destroy the nerves and produce all manner of evil. Their persistence in taking it, in spite of all her warnings, distressed her so much that I really thought she would relinquish the sale of it and so lose half her custom. I was driven to my wits' end for instances of longevity entirely attributable to a persevering use of green tea. But the final argument, which settled the question, was a happy reference of mine to the train oil and tallow candles which the indigenous peoples of the Arctic not only enjoy but digest. After that, she acknowledged the truth in the old saying that one man's meat might be another man's poison. She contented herself thenceforward with an occasional remonstrance when she thought the purchaser was too young and innocent to be acquainted with the evil effects green tea produced on some constitutions. This was followed by an habitual sigh when people old enough to choose more wisely would still prefer it. I went over from Drumble once a quarter at least to settle the accounts and see after the necessary business letters. And speaking of letters, I began to be very much ashamed of remembering my letter to the Aga Jenkins, and very glad I had never named my writing to anyone. I only hoped the letter was lost. No answer came. No sign was made. About a year after Miss Matty set up shop, I received one of Martha's hieroglyphics, begging me to come to Cranford very soon. I was afraid that Miss Matty was ill and went off that very afternoon. I took Martha by surprise when she saw me on opening the door. We went into the kitchen as usual to have our confidential conference. It was then that Martha told me she was expecting her confinement very soon, in a week or two. She did not think Miss Matty was aware of it and wanted me to break the news to her. Martha continued, crying hysterically, that she was afraid her mistress would not approve of it. She was sure she did not know who was to take care of Miss Matty as she should be when she herself was laid up. I comforted Martha, by telling her I would remain till she was about again. I only wish she had told me her reason for this sudden summons, as then I would have brought the requisite stock of clothes. But Martha was so tearful and tender in spirit, and so unlike her usual self, that I said as little as possible about my own affairs. I endeavored instead to comfort her under all the probable and possible misfortunes which came crowding upon her imagination. I then stole out of the house door and made my appearance as if I were a customer in the shop. This was just to take Miss Matty by surprise and to gain an idea of how she looked in her new situation. It was warm May weather, so only the little half door was closed. Miss Matty sat behind the counter, knitting an elaborate pair of garters. They seemed elaborate to me, but the difficult stitch was no weight upon her mind, for she was singing in a low voice to herself as her needles went rapidly in and out. I call it singing, but I dare say a musician would not use that word for the tuneless yet sweet humming of her low, worn voice. I found out from the words far more than from the attempt at the tune that it was the old hundredth she was crooning to herself. The quiet, continuous sound told of content, and it gave me a pleasant feeling as I stood in the street just outside the door, quite in harmony with that soft May morning. I went in. At first, she did not catch who it was, and stood up as if to serve me. But in another minute, her watchful cat had clutched her knitting, which was then dropped in eager joy at seeing me. I found, after we had had a little conversation, that it was just as Martha had said. Miss Matty had no idea of the approaching household event, so I thought I would let things take their course. I felt secure that when I eventually went to her with the baby in my arms, I should obtain that forgiveness for Martha. It was a forgiveness. She was needlessly frightening herself into believing that Miss Matty would withhold, under some notion that the new baby would require attentions from its mother that would be a faithless treason to Miss Matty to provide. But I was right. I think that must be a hereditary quality, for my father says he is scarcely ever wrong. One morning, within a week after I arrived, I went to call on Miss Matty with a little bundle of flannel in my arms. She was very much awestruck when I showed her what it was. She asked for her spectacles off the dressing table and looked at the baby curiously, with a sort of tender wonder at its small perfection of parts. She could not banish the thought of the surprise all day, but went about on tiptoe and was very silent. But she did steal up to see Martha, and they both cried with joy. She then got into a complimentary speech to Jem and did not know how to get out of it again. She was only extricated from her dilemma by the sound of the shop bell, which was an equal relief to the shy, proud, and honest Jem. He shook my hand so vigorously when I congratulated him that I think I feel the pain of it yet. I had a busy life while Martha was laid up. I attended on Miss Matty and prepared her meals. I cast up her accounts and examined the state of her canisters and tumblers. I also helped her occasionally in the shop. It gave me no small amusement, and sometimes a little uneasiness, to watch her ways there. If a little child came in to ask for an ounce of almond comfits, which was about 4 of the large kind Miss Matty sold, she always added one more. This was for what she called good measure, although the scale was already handsomely turned in the customer's favor. When I remonstrated against this, her reply was always that the little things liked it so much. There was no use in telling her that the fifth comfit weighed 1/4 of an ounce and made every sale into a loss for her. So I remembered the green tea and winged my shaft with a feather out of her own plumage. I told her how unwholesome almond comfits were and how ill an excess of them might make the little children. This argument produced some effect, for, henceforward, instead of the fifth comfit, she always told them to hold out their tiny palms. Into these she would shake either peppermint or ginger lozenges as a preventive to the dangers that might arise from the previous sale. Altogether, the lozenge trade conducted on these principles did not promise to be remunerative, but I was happy to find she had made more than £20 during the last year by her sales of tea. Moreover, now that she was accustomed to it, she did not dislike the employment, which brought her into kindly intercourse with many of the people round about. If she gave them good weight, they, in their turn, brought many a little country present to the old rector's daughter. These included a cream cheese, a few newly laid eggs, a little fresh ripe fruit, or a bunch of flowers. The counter was quite loaded with these offerings sometimes, as she told me. As for Cranford in general, it was going on much as usual. The Jamieson and Hoggins feud still raged, if a feud it could be called when only one side cared much about it. Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins were very happy together and, like most very happy people, quite ready to be friendly. Indeed, Mrs. Hoggins was really desirous to be restored to Mrs. Jamieson's good graces because of their former intimacy. But Mrs. Jamieson considered their very happiness an insult to the Glenmire family, to which she still had the honor to belong. She doggedly refused and rejected every advance. Mr. Mulliner, like a faithful clansman, espoused his mistress's side with ardor. If he saw either Mr. or Mrs. Hoggins, he would cross the street and appear absorbed in the contemplation of life in general, and his own path in particular, until he had passed them by. Miss Pole used to amuse herself by wondering what in the world Mrs. Jamieson would do if either she, or Mr. Mulliner, or any other member of her household was taken ill. She could hardly have the face to call in Mr. Hoggins after the way she had behaved to them. Miss Pole grew quite impatient for some indisposition or accident to befall Mrs. Jamieson or her dependents, so that Cranford might see how she would act under the perplexing circumstances. Martha was beginning to go about again, and I had already fixed a limit, not very far distant, for my visit. One afternoon I was sitting in the shop parlor with Miss Matty. I remember the weather was colder now than it had been in May 3 weeks before. We had a fire and kept the door fully closed. We saw a gentleman go slowly past the window and then stand opposite to the door, as if looking for the name which we had so carefully hidden. He took out a double eyeglass and peered about for some time before he could discover it. Then he came in. All on a sudden, it flashed across me that it was the Aga himself. His clothes had an unusual foreign cut about them, and his face was a deep brown, as if it had been tanned and retanned by the sun. His complexion contrasted oddly with his plentiful snow-white hair. His eyes were dark and piercing, and he had an odd way of contracting them and puckering up his cheeks into innumerable wrinkles when he looked earnestly at objects. He did so to Miss Matty when he first came in. His glance had first caught and lingered a little upon me, but then turned, with the peculiar searching look I have described, to Miss Matty. She was a little fluttered and nervous, but no more so than she always was when any man came into her shop. She thought that he would probably have a note, or a sovereign at least, for which she would have to give change. This was an operation she very much disliked to perform. But the present customer stood opposite to her without asking for anything. He only looked fixedly at her as he drummed upon the table with his fingers, for all the world, just as Miss Jenkins used to do. Miss Matty was on the point of asking him what he wanted, as she told me afterwards when he turned sharply to me. He asked if my name was Mary Smith. I confirmed that it was. All my doubts as to his identity were set at rest. I only wondered what he would say or do next, and how Miss Matty would stand the joyful shock of what he had to reveal. Apparently, he was at a loss as to how to announce himself. He looked round at last in search of something to buy so as to gain time. As it happened, his eye caught on the almond comfits, and he boldly asked for a pound of those things. I doubt if Miss Matty had a whole pound in the shop, and besides the unusual magnitude of the order, she was distressed with the idea of the indigestion they would produce, taken in such unlimited quantities. She looked up to remonstrate. Something of a tender relaxation in his face struck home to her heart. She stammered, asking if it was him. Oh, sir, if he could possibly be Peter. And she trembled from head to foot. In a moment he was round the table and had her in his arms while she sobbed the tearless cries of old age. I brought her a glass of wine, for indeed her color had changed so as to alarm me, and Mr. Peter too. He kept reassuring her, telling her that he had been too sudden for her, calling her his little girl. I proposed that she should go at once up into the drawing-room and lie down on the sofa there. She looked wistfully at her brother, whose hand she had held tight, even when she was nearly fainting. Upon his assuring her that he would not leave her, she allowed him to carry her upstairs. I thought that the best I could do was to run and put the kettle on the fire for early tea. Then I would attend to the shop, leaving the brother and sister to exchange some of the many thousand things they must have to say. I also had to break the news to Martha, who received it with a burst of tears which nearly infected me. She kept recovering herself to ask if I was sure it was indeed Miss Matty's brother. I had mentioned that he had gray hair, and she had always heard that he was a very handsome young man. Something of the same kind perplexed Miss Matty at tea time. She was installed in the great easy-chair opposite to Mr. Jenkins in order to gaze her fill. She could hardly drink for looking at him, and as for eating, that was out of the question. She mused almost to herself that she supposed hot climates aged people very quickly. She remarked to him that when he left Cranford, he had not a single gray hair in his head. Mr. Peter only smiled, asking in return how many years ago that was. She seemed to realize the passage of time, sighing that it was true, and that she supposed they were both getting old. But still, she did not think they were so very old. Then, a little afraid lest she had hurt him, she added that white hair was very becoming to him. He replied that he supposed he had forgotten dates too. He then asked what she thought he had brought for her from India. He revealed that he had an Indian muslin gown and a pearl necklace for her, somewhere in his chest at Portsmouth. He smiled as if amused at the idea of the incongruity of his presence with the appearance of his sister. This did not strike her all at once, while the elegance of the articles did. I could see that for a moment her imagination dwelt complacently on the idea of herself thus attired. Instinctively, she put her hand up to her throat, that little delicate throat which, as Miss Pole had once told me, had been one of her youthful charms. But the hand met the touch of folds of soft muslin in which she was always swathed up to her chin. The sensation recalled a sense of the unsuitableness of a pearl necklace to her age. She said she was afraid she was too old, but that it was very kind of him to think of it. The gifts were just what she should have liked years ago, when she was young. He told her that was just what he thought, my little Matty. He had remembered her tastes, which were so like their dear mother's. At the mention of that name, the brother and sister clasped each other's hands yet more fondly. Although they were perfectly silent, I fancied they might have something more to say if they were unchecked by my presence. I got up to arrange my room for Mr. Peter's occupation that night, intending to share Miss Matty's bed myself. But at my movement, he started up. He announced that he must go and settle about a room at the George Inn, as his carpet-bag was there too. Miss Matty cried out in great distress. No, he must not go. She pleaded with dear Peter and with me, insisting that he must not go. She was so much agitated that we both promised everything she wished. Peter sat down again and gave her his hand, which for better security she held in both of hers. I then left the room to accomplish my arrangements. Long into the night, and far into the morning, Miss Matty and I talked. She had much to tell me of her brother's life and adventures, which he had communicated to her as they had sat alone. She said all was thoroughly clear to her, but I never quite understood the whole story. When in after days I lost my awe of Mr. Peter enough to question him myself, he only laughed at my curiosity and told me stories that sounded so very much like those of Baron Munchausen that I was sure he was making fun of me. What I heard from Miss Matty was this. He had been a volunteer at the siege of Rangoon and had been taken prisoner by the Burmese. He had somehow obtained favor and eventual freedom from knowing how to bleed the chief of a small tribe in some case of dangerous illness. On his release from years of captivity, his letters from England had been returned with the ominous word dead marked upon them. Believing himself to be the last of his race, he had settled down as an indigo planter. He had proposed to spend the remainder of his life in the country, to whose inhabitants and modes of life he had become habituated. It was then that my letter had reached him. With the odd vehemence which characterized him in age, as it had done in youth, he had sold his land and all his possessions to the first purchaser. He then came home to his poor old sister, who was more glad and rich than any princess when she looked at him. She talked me to sleep at last. Later, I was awakened by a slight sound at the door, for which she begged my pardon as she crept penitently into bed. It seems that when I could no longer confirm her belief that the long-lost brother was really there, under the same roof, she had begun to fear. She feared lest it was only a waking dream of hers that there never had been a Peter sitting by her all that blessed evening, but that the real Peter lay dead far away beneath some wild sea wave, or under some strange eastern tree. This nervous feeling of hers had become so strong that she felt compelled to get up and go convince herself that he was really there. She did this by listening through the door to his even regular breathing. I do not like to call it snoring, but I heard it myself through 2 closed doors. After a while, the sound soothed Miss Matty to sleep. I do not believe Mr. Peter came home from India as rich as a nabob. He even considered himself poor, but neither he nor Miss Matty cared much about that. At any rate, he had enough to live upon very genteelly at Cranford, he and Miss Matty together. A day or 2 after his arrival, the shop was closed, while troops of little urchins gleefully awaited the shower of comfits and lozenges. These came down from time to time upon their faces as they stood gazing up at Miss Matty's drawing-room windows. Occasionally, Miss Matty, half hidden behind the curtains, would plead with them not to make themselves ill, but a strong arm would pull her back, and a more rattling shower than ever would succeed. A part of the tea was sent in presents to the Cranford ladies. Some of it was distributed among the old people who remembered Mr. Peter in the days of his frolicsome youth. The Indian muslin gown was reserved for darling Flora Gordon, who was Miss Jessie Brown's daughter. The Gordons had been on the continent for the last few years, but were now expected to return very soon. Miss Matty, in her sisterly pride, anticipated great delight in the joy of showing them Mr. Peter. The pearl necklace disappeared. About that time, many handsome and useful presents made their appearance in the households of Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester. Some rare and delicate Indian ornaments graced the drawing rooms of Mrs. Jameson and Mrs. Fitzadam. I myself was not forgotten. Among other things, I had the most handsomely bound and best edition of Dr. Johnson's works that could be procured. Dear Miss Matty, with tears in her eyes, begged me to consider it as a present from her sister as well as from herself. In short, no one was forgotten. And what was more, every one, however insignificant, who had shown kindness to Miss Matty at any time, was sure of Mr. Peter's cordial regard. Chapter 16. It was not surprising that Mr. Peter became such a favorite at Cranford. The ladies vied with each other as to who should admire him most. And it was no wonder, for their quiet lives were astonishingly stirred up by his arrival from India. This was especially true as the person who had arrived told more wonderful stories than Sinbad the sailor. As Miss Pole said, he was quite as good as an Arabian Night any evening. For my own part, I had vibrated all my life between Drumble and Cranford, and I thought it was quite possible that all Mr. Peter's stories might be true, although they were wonderful. But when I found that if we swallowed an anecdote of a tolerable magnitude one week, we had the dose considerably increased the next, I began to have my doubts. I especially grew suspicious when I noticed that if his sister was present, his accounts of Indian life were comparatively tame. It was not that she knew more than we did, perhaps she knew less. I also noticed that when the rector came to call, Mr. Peter talked in a different way about the countries he had been in. But I do not think the ladies in Cranford would have considered him such a wonderful traveler if they had only heard him talk in the quiet way he did to the rector. Indeed, they liked him the better for being what they described as being so very oriental. One day, at a select party in his honor which Miss Pole gave, Mr. Peter made a special request. It was a party from which Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins and Mrs. Fitzadam were necessarily excluded, as Mrs. Jameson had honored it with her presence and had even offered to send Mr. Mulliner to wait. At this party, Mr. Peters said he was tired of sitting upright against the hard-backed, uneasy chairs. He asked if he might not indulge himself in sitting cross-legged. Miss Pole's consent was eagerly given, and down he went with the utmost gravity. But when she asked me in an audible whisper if he did not remind me of the father of the faithful, I could not help thinking of poor Simon Jones, the lame tailor. And while Mrs. Jameson slowly commented on the elegance and convenience of the attitude, I remembered how we had all followed that lady's lead in condemning Mr. Hoggins for vulgarity, simply because he crossed his legs as he sat still on his chair. Many of Mr. Peters' ways of eating were a little strange amongst such ladies as Miss Pole and Miss Matty and Mrs. Jameson, especially when I recollected the untasted green peas and the two-pronged forks at poor Mr. Holbrook's dinner. The mention of Mr. Holbrook's name recalls to my mind a conversation between Mr. Peter and Miss Matty. It took place one evening in the summer after he had returned to Cranford. The day had been very hot, and Miss Matty had been much oppressed by the weather, a heat in which her brother revelled. I remember that she had been unable to nurse Martha's baby, which had become her favorite employment of late. The baby was as much at home in her arms as in its mother's, as long as it remained a lightweight, portable by one so fragile as Miss Matty. On this particular day, Miss Matty had seemed more than usually feeble and languid. She only revived when the sun went down and her sofa was wheeled to the open window. Although it looked into the principal street of Cranford, the fragrant smell of the neighboring hayfields came in every now and then. It was borne by the soft breezes that stirred the dull air of the summer twilight, and then died away. The silence of the sultry atmosphere was lost in the murmuring noises from many an open window and door. Even the children were still abroad in the street, late as it was, between 10 and 11, enjoying the play for which they had not had spirits during the heat of the day. It was a source of satisfaction to Miss Matty to see how few candles were lighted, even in the apartments of those houses from which issued the greatest signs of life. Mr. Peter, Miss Matty, and I had all been quiet for some little time, each with a separate reverie. It was Mr. Peter who broke the silence. He asked little Matty if she knew that he could have sworn she was on the high road to matrimony when he left England that last time. He declared that if anybody had told him then that she would have lived and died an old maid, he should have laughed in their faces. Miss Matty made no reply. I tried in vain to think of some subject which should effectually turn the conversation, but I was very stupid. Before I could speak, he went on. He said it was Holbrook, that fine, manly fellow who lived at Woodley, that he used to think would carry off his little Matty. He supposed I would not think it now, but his sister was once a very pretty girl, or at least he had thought so, and he had a notion poor Holbrook did too. He wondered what business Holbrook had to die before he came home to thank him for all his kindness to a worthless cub like himself. That kindness was what first made him think Holbrook cared for her, for in all their fishing expeditions, it was always Matty they talked about. He then recalled poor Deborah, and what a lecture she had read him on, having asked Holbrook home to lunch one day. She had seen the Arley carriage in the town, and thought that her ladyship might call. He mused that it was long years ago, more than half a lifetime, and yet it seemed like yesterday. He knew of no fellow he should have liked better as a brother-in-law. He then turned to his sister, suggesting she must have played her cards badly, somehow or another. He teased her, asking if she had wanted her brother to be a good go-between. As he spoke, he put out his hand to take hold of hers as she lay on the sofa. But then he stopped short. He exclaimed, "What was this?" He declared that she was shivering and shaking Matty with that confounded open window. He then gave me a sharp order to shut it that very minute. I did as he asked, and then stooped down to kiss Miss Matty and see if she really were chilled. She caught at my hand and gave it a hard squeeze. It was unconsciously done, I think, for in a minute or two she spoke to us quite in her usual voice. She smiled our uneasiness away, although she patiently submitted to the prescriptions we enforced of a warm bed and a glass of weak negus. I was to leave Cranford the next day. Before I went, I saw that all the effects of the open window had quite vanished. I had superintended most of the alterations necessary in the house and household during the latter weeks of my stay. The shop was once more a parlor, and the empty, resounding rooms were again furnished, up to the very garrets. There had been some talk of establishing Martha and Jem in another house, but Miss Matty would not hear of it. Indeed, I never saw her so much roused as when Miss Pole had assumed it to be the most desirable arrangement. As long as Martha would remain with Miss Matty was only too thankful to have her about her. And Jem, too, who was a very pleasant man to have in the house, for she never saw him from one week's end to the next. And as for the probable children, if they would all turn out to be such little darlings as her goddaughter, Matilda, she should not mind the number, if Martha did not. Besides, the next was to be called Deborah, a point which Miss Matty had reluctantly yielded to Martha's stubborn determination that her firstborn was to be Matilda. So Miss Pole had to lower her colors, and even her voice, when she later told me that as Mr. and Mrs. Hearn were still to go on living in the same house, we had certainly done a wise thing in hiring Martha's niece as an auxiliary. I left Miss Matty and Mr. Peter most comfortable and contented. The only subject for regret to the tender heart of the one and the social, friendly nature of the other was the unfortunate quarrel between Mrs. Jamieson and the plebeian Hogginses and their following. In joke, I prophesied one day that this would only last until Mrs. Jamieson or Mr. Mulliner were ill, in which case they would be only too glad to be friends with Mr. Hoggins. But Miss Matty did not like my looking forward to anything like illness in so light a manner. Before the year was out, however, all had come round in a far more satisfactory way. I received 2 Cranford letters on one auspicious October morning. Both Miss Pole and Miss Matty wrote to ask me to come over and meet the Gordons, who had returned to England alive and well with their 2 children, now almost grown up. Dear Jessie Brown had kept her old kind nature, although she had changed her name and station. She wrote to say that she and Major Gordon expected to be in Cranford on the 14th. She hoped and begged to be remembered to a long list of friends. Mrs. Jamieson was named first, as became her honorable station. Then came Miss Pole and Miss Matty, with a question of whether she could ever forget their kindness to her poor father and sister. Then Mrs. Forrester and Mr. Hoggins, with another allusion to kindness shown to the dead long ago. His new wife was also mentioned, whom Mrs. Gordon must desire to make the acquaintance of, as she was an old Scotch friend of her husband's. In short, every one was named, from the rector down to Miss Betty Barker. The rector had been appointed to Cranford in the interim between Captain Brown's death and Miss Jessie's marriage, and was now associated with the latter event. All were asked to the luncheon, all except Mrs. Fitzadam, who had come to live in Cranford since Miss Jessie Brown's days. I found her rather moping on account of the omission. People wondered at Miss Betty Barker's being included in the honorable list. But, as Miss Pole explained, we must remember the disregard of the genteel proprieties of life in which the poor captain had educated his girls. For his sake, we swallowed our pride. Indeed, Mrs. Jameson rather took it as a compliment, as it put Miss Betty, who was formerly her maid, on a level with the family she referred to as those Hogginses. But when I arrived in Cranford, nothing was as yet ascertained of Mrs. Jameson's own intentions. Would the honorable lady go, or would she not? Mr. Peter declared that she should, and she would. Miss Pole just shook her head and desponded. But Mr. Peter was a man of resources. In the first place, he persuaded Miss Matty to write to Mrs. Gordon. He had her tell of Mrs. Fitzadam's existence, and beg that one so kind, cordial, and generous might be included in the pleasant invitation. An answer came back by return of post, with a pretty little note from Mrs. Fitzadam, and a request that Miss Matty would deliver it herself and explain the previous omission. Mrs. Fitzadam was as pleased as could be, and thanked Miss Matty over and over again. Mr. Peter had simply told us to leave Mrs. Jameson to him, so we did. This was especially because we knew there was nothing we could do to alter her determination if it was once formed. I did not know, nor did Miss Matty, how things were going on, until Miss Pole asked me a question just the day before Mrs. Gordon came. She asked if I thought there was anything between Mr. Peter and Mrs. Jamieson in the matrimonial line. This was because Mrs. Jamieson was really going to the lunch at the George Inn. She had sent Mr. Mulliner down to desire that a footstool might be put to the warmest seat in the room, as she meant to come and knew that their chairs were very high. Miss Pole had picked up this piece of news, and from it she conjectured all sorts of things and bemoaned the situation yet more. She worried what would become of poor dear Miss Matty if Peter should marry, and Mrs. Jameson of all people. Miss Pole seemed to think there were other ladies in Cranford who would have done more credit to his choice. I think she must have had someone who was unmarried in her head, for she kept saying that it showed such a want of delicacy in a widow to think of such a thing. When I got back to Miss Matty's, I really did begin to think that Mr. Peter might be thinking of Mrs. Jameson for a wife. I was as unhappy as Miss Pole about it. He had the proof sheet of a great placard in his hand. It announced that Signor Brunoni, who was described as magician to the King of Delhi, the Raja of Oud, and the Great Lama of Tibet, and so on, was going to perform in Cranford for one night only. This was to be on the very next night. Miss Matty, exultant, showed me a letter from the Gordons promising to remain over for this gaiety, which she said was entirely Peter's doing. He had written to ask the signor to come and was to be at all the expenses of the affair. Tickets were to be sent gratis to as many as the room would hold. In short, Miss Matty was charmed with the plan. She said that tomorrow Cranford would remind her of the Preston Guild to which she had been in her youth. There would be a luncheon at the George Inn with the dear Gordons and the Signor in the assembly room in the evening, but I looked only at the fatal words written on the placard. It stated the event was under the patronage of the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson. She, then, was chosen to preside over this entertainment of Mr. Peters. She was perhaps going to displace my dear Miss Matty in his heart and make her life lonely once more. I could not look forward to the morrow with any pleasure. Every innocent anticipation of Miss Matty's only served to add to my annoyance. So angry and irritated, and exaggerating every little incident which could add to my irritation, I went on until we were all assembled in the great parlor at the George Inn. Major and Mrs. Gordon and pretty Flora and Mr. Ludovic were all as bright and handsome and friendly as could be. But I could hardly attend to them, for I was watching Mr. Peter, and I saw that Miss Pole was equally busy. I had never seen Mrs. Jamieson so roused and animated before. Her face looked full of interest in what Mr. Peter was saying. I drew near to listen. My relief was great when I caught that his words were not words of love, but that, for all his grave face, he was at his old tricks. He was telling her of his travels in India and describing the wonderful height of the Himalaya mountains. One touch after another added to their size, and each exceeded the former in absurdity, but Mrs. Jamieson really enjoyed all in perfect good faith. I suppose she required strong stimulants to excite her to come out of her apathy. Mr. Peter wound up his account by saying that, of course, at that altitude there were none of the animals to be found that existed in the lower regions. The game, everything, was different. Firing one day at some flying creature, he was very much dismayed when it fell to find that he had shot a cherubim. Mr. Peter caught my eye at this moment and gave me such a funny twinkle that I felt sure he had no thoughts of Mrs. Jamieson as a wife from that time. She looked uncomfortably amazed. She wondered if he did not think shooting a cherubim was sacrilege. Mr. Peter composed his countenance in a moment and appeared shocked at the idea. It was an idea which, as he said truly enough, was now presented to him for the first time. But then, he reminded her, she must remember that he had been living for a long time among savages, all of whom were heathens. Some of them, he feared, were downright dissenters. Then, seeing Miss Matty draw near, he hastily changed the conversation. After a little while, turning to me, he told me not to be shocked at all his wonderful stories. He considered Mrs. Jamieson fair game. Besides, he was bent on propitiating her, and the first step towards it was keeping her well awake. He had bribed her to be there by asking her to let him have her name as patroness for his poor conjurer that evening. He did not want to give her time enough to get up her rancor against the Hogginses, who were just coming in. He said he wanted everybody to be friends, for it harassed Matty so much to hear of these quarrels. He intended to go at it again later, so I need not look so shocked. He planned to enter the assembly room that night with Mrs. Jamieson on one side and my lady, Mrs. Hoggins, on the other. He told me to just wait and see if he did not. Somehow or another, he did. He fairly got them into conversation together. Major and Mrs. Gordon helped at the good work with their perfect ignorance of any existing coolness between any of the inhabitants of Cranford. Ever since that day, There has been the old friendly sociability in Cranford society. I am thankful for this, because of my dear Miss Matty's love of peace and kindliness. We all love Miss Matty, and I somehow think we are all of us better when she is near us.